Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. If the U.S. government is imprisoning and expelling people for their opinions, what's the future of free speech in America? Let's get to the bottom line. The crackdown on pro-Palestinian student activism in the United States has been in full gear for months now, with hundreds of people arrested, deported, or disciplined by their colleges for speaking up against the war on Gaza. The Trump administration is focused on universities because it sees them as a source of pro-Palestine sentiment in America. But in a courtroom in Boston, a group of academics has been suing the Trump administration to defend constitutionally protected speech, including anti-war speech. So can their effort push back on the widening assault on the First Amendment and higher education? Today, we're speaking with the leader of one of the institutions that brought that lawsuit, Jamil Jaffer, executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Jamil, thank you so much for joining us today. Look, there are a number of organizations that have joined this lawsuit, academics basically challenging Secretary of State Marco Rubio for these sanctions against constitutionally protected free speech. You're saying this right has been infringed on various non-citizens who are legal residents legally in the United States. But tell us more about why you've joined this lawsuit and your institution's concerns.
Sure, yeah. So we filed this lawsuit in the spring on behalf of the American Association of University Professors and the Middle East Studies Association, challenging the Trump administration's policy of arresting, detaining, and attempting to deport students who participated in pro-Palestinian advocacy on campus. And, as you know, the Trump administration has already arrested and imprisoned and tried to deport many of these students. It has canceled the visas of many others. And again, all of this is because the students had the audacity to exercise what until very recently, everybody understood to be constitutionally protected rights, the freedom of speech, the freedom to dissent. The lawsuit is before Judge William Young in Boston, in the Federal District of Massachusetts, and he heard 2 weeks of testimony. So we're now waiting for a ruling from the district court.
Can you tell us about some of the people who have been detained? Mahmoud Khalil, Rumeysa Ozturk, Mohsen Madawi. There are a number of these people, but can you kind of share with our audience a little bit about these individual cases?
Yeah, so these are all students who participated in pro-Palestinian advocacy in one way or another. Mohsen Madawi and Mahmoud Khalil were leaders of the student protest movement at Columbia. Rumeysa Ozturk was at Tufts University and was arrested and detained and threatened with deportation because she wrote an op-ed for her student newspaper calling for divestment from Israel. All these students have exercised their First Amendment right to dissent, some of them by participating in public protests, some of them by writing and publishing pieces that are critical of Israel. One of the things that we sort of knew before we filed the lawsuit and have confirmed through the trial is that the Trump administration, while it says it is focused on anti-Semitism, has interpreted the phrase anti-Semitism so broadly that it encompasses virtually any protest relating to Israel's actions in Gaza. So any student who protested the war in Gaza is subject to possible arrest and detention under this, and deportation, any foreign student under this policy. And, that is first of all, a crazy understanding of anti-Semitism, to understand the term that broadly, but also an unconstitutional interpretation of the government's power to detain and arrest and deport, because the First Amendment limits the government's power in those respects. The government does not have the authority to put people behind bars because it disagrees with what they have to say. That's sort of the core principle of the First Amendment. If the First Amendment protects anything at all, it protects people against imprisonment based on their political views. But that's what's going on here.
So many leading U.S. officials and former officials are saying much of the same thing, that these students that have been detained, that have been challenged in court, et cetera, are saying. Is anyone making that case that, in fact, in our own debate, many of the students' comments are within the realm of American debate today?
Yeah, well, the judge in our case, actually, the very first question he asked of the government at the beginning of trial, he asked the government, do you believe that the First Amendment protects non-citizens to the same extent it protects citizens? And the judge was asking this question because of what you just pointed out. And so then the question becomes, well, is it different? Does the First Amendment somehow operate differently or with less force when it comes to non-citizens? And the government initially said, no, our view is that the First Amendment does provide the same protection to non-citizens as it does to citizens. But then within 10 minutes, walk back that answer. And over the course of the trial, they have come to a new position, which is that the First Amendment does not protect non-citizens to the same extent it protects citizens. And their entire case, I think, is based on that proposition, because if you accept that non-citizens are protected by the First Amendment, then it's obvious that this policy is unconstitutional, because the government can't punish American citizens because it disagrees with what they have to say. I mean, that has been settled law for 100 years. And so the government has to rely entirely on this theory that the First Amendment is somehow indifferent to the free speech rights of non-citizens, which is not the case.
Listen, I want to play a clip for you of Secretary of State Marco Rubio responding to this issue about visa revocation.
I think it's crazy to invite students into your country that are coming onto your campus and destabilizing it. We're just not going to have it. So we'll revoke your visa, and once your visa is revoked, you're illegally in the country and you have to leave. Every country in the world has a right to decide who comes in as a visitor and who doesn't. Every time I find one of these lunatics, I take away their visa.
You're saying it could be more than 300?
Sure, I hope. At some point I hope we run out because we've gotten rid of all of them.
I guess I'm trying to understand, how is our ecosystem allowing, and you're involved in this court case, allowing such a focus on one sliver, on the Palestine, Gaza, Israel issue, when in fact our history is rife with cases where we've had protests, struggles, debates over lots of global issues. I mean, it just makes me think, what if this been during the time of apartheid? Would we be revoking the visas of people who were fighting apartheid at American universities?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the many ironies here is that, a lot of these students came to the United States because of our constitutionally protected freedoms. I mean, that's why, people admire the United States. It's why people from all over the world want to come here. And then to, punish those people because they exercise those freedoms, there's something, truly perverse about that. But I guess, one other thing that I think is important to recognize here is that the argument that that Secretary Rubio is relying on to justify the deportation of these students is that their protest undermines American foreign policy interests. He is invoking a provision of the INA, of the Immigration Act, that was put into the U.S. Code at the height of the Cold War, and it allows, at the height of the McCarthy era, and it allows the Secretary of State to deport people if their activities in the United States are undermining U.S. foreign policy interests. This is a provision that has rarely been used, and I think never been used against legal permanent residents before. But that's the provision that Secretary Rubio is relying on. But if you accept that the Secretary of State has the power to deport non-citizens because he concludes that their advocacy is somehow inconsistent with American foreign policy interests, there is no reason why this power would be limited to students that are engaged in pro-Palestinian advocacy. It could be students engaged in pro-Ukrainian advocacy, or students engaged in pro-Greenland or pro-Canada advocacy. There's really no limit to the power that that Secretary Rubio is claiming here. And I just don't think there's any way of squaring that argument with the First Amendment, which the Supreme Court has long understood to protect not just citizens, but non-citizens as well. That's been true since 1945, when the court decided a case called Bridges versus Wixon, which is a case involving an Australian citizen who was a labor leader here in the United States for many years, and the government wanted to deport him on the grounds that he was a communist. And the Supreme Court rejected the government's effort to deport him, finding that the First Amendment's protections extended to non-citizens, even in the deportation context. And I think that if the government can't deport a non-citizen in 1945 for suspected communism, it can't deport foreign students in 2025 for their advocacy for Palestine. I think that that's clearly established First Amendment law, and I'm hopeful that that's what the district court is going to say in this case.
Jamil, do you know anything, or have we learned anything through the legal process in this court case about how these individuals were actually targeted and found? I mean, there are a lot of people in the country. I'm always interested, okay, how did this person become, the poster child for this debate? We've been reading, leaks here and there that perhaps it's Israeli databases, it's Israeli information and photos that have come in, and it raises an interesting question about governance. I mean, I'd like to know your answer on that, but if in fact we do have a foreign government and a foreign population that's involved in targeting these people who are legal residents in the United States, I mean, that just opens up a big can of worms, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what we learned through this case. So we learned that the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State were instructed to investigate students who had participated in pro-Palestinian protests on campus for possible arrest and detention and deportation. In order to identify students for investigation, DHS looked almost entirely to the blacklist that had been compiled by Canary Mission and Betar, which are both extreme pro-Israel groups that identify students that, in their view, have engaged in speech that is anti-Israel, anti-American, or anti-Semitic. And there were 5,000 names that DHS got from Canary Mission, and it wrote investigative reports on somewhere between 100 and 200 of them. And some of those reports were forwarded by DHS to the State Department with recommendations or with findings justifying or purportedly justifying deportation, and the State Department then acted on those those letters and reports. So all of this sort of stems from, in the first instance, these blacklists compiled by these extremist organizations, which were not subject to any meaningful vetting by the State Department or by the Department of Homeland Security. It's actually quite, astounding that DHS and DOS essentially turned over the fact-finding process to these extremist organizations, and that it was Canary Mission's website that really provided the foundation for this whole policy.
And is that legal? I mean, is it legal in the sense that unvetted foreign-based information can be brought against legal? I mean, I'm just sort of perplexed. But I do want to post something up for you to read that was President Trump actually issuing the order on this. So this is the President of the United States who's basically saying overtly that we're doing this. We're going to round up and arrest these non-citizens in the universities. And I guess I understand your lawsuit, but it's not like you're trying to sort of prove that they're doing it. They're admitting that they're doing it, right?
Yeah.
So
I think
what's the difference in that? There's no subterfuge here.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. They're admitting, not just admitting that they're doing it. They're bragging about it. They want political credit for it. And that's what we've sort of emphasized to to the court. But one of the things we wanted to establish through this case is that they arrested this relatively small number of students in order to intimidate others. That the whole point of this was to stigmatize, delegitimize a political viewpoint that the government doesn't like, and to silence the people who would otherwise be advocating that viewpoint. And I think, unfortunately, that this policy has been wildly effective, that because of the threat of arrest and detention and deportation, there are foreign students at campuses all over the country and foreign faculty at campuses all over the country who are terrified of exercising their First Amendment rights. They're terrified that if they go and engage in peaceful, constitutionally protected conduct, peaceful, constitutionally protected protest activity, that they will get a knock on the door from ICE that afternoon. And that's terrible. It's if the government passed a law that made it illegal for people to participate in this kind of protest activity, that kind of law would be obviously unconstitutional. But what they're doing here, this policy that they've adopted, has exactly the same effect. It has the effect of silencing people and stifling a political viewpoint that the government doesn't like. I think that it's plainly an affront to the First Amendment, and again, we're hoping that's where the court lands.
So look, you're at a university, you're Columbia University. You've talked to a lot of academics. You're assigned with this Association of American Professors, et cetera. And I'm interested in the thinking about your case. If you were to win this case, if the judgment were to come out in favor of what you're doing, is that going to solve the problem of intimidation, of the stifling of intellectual expression and First Amendment expression? Are we done? Is the box checked off?
Yeah.
Or are you worried that the ecosystem around free thought in universities in America, protected free speech, is still going to sink?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that there are many sources of chill here, right? Even before the Trump administration was arresting students for their political views, many students were afraid to speak out because their universities had sanctioned students for participating in pro-Palestinian protests. Private businesses were refusing to hire students who participated in anti-war activities. So there are lots of sources of chill here. That said, I think probably the most important source of chill is the threat of arrest and detention and deportation. I mean, that is a threat on a different order than any of the other threats that I mentioned. And I think that taking that threat off the table would go a long way towards creating more space for political dissent that is supposedly constitutionally protected.
I don't know how much interaction you have with undergraduates and graduates that are American citizens, but one thing that we saw during the summer of protests over Palestine and Gaza was that this was a widespread national phenomena in universities throughout the country. So the notion that a few non-American legal residents, at universities somehow concocted all of this just doesn't align with the realities that we saw at that time. In fact, I interviewed a lot of folks at U.S. universities across the country. In fact, many people make the argument that Joe Biden lost the election by, in fact, not responding and taking that kind of protest about Gaza seriously. So my question is, how are those people reacting in this moment who are not the ones necessarily being chased and detained by ICE, but U.S. citizens at colleges and universities watching this happen?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons we brought this case on behalf of the American Association of University Professors and the Middle East Studies Association is that they have both U.S. citizen and non-citizen members. And we wanted to highlight the implications of the detentions of non-citizens for the citizen members as well. Because, all of these U.S. citizen students and faculty who previously participated in public protests, standing shoulder to shoulder with non-citizens, are now deprived of the opportunity of associating with those non-citizens. They no longer hear the viewpoints of the non-citizens. A lot of those non-citizens are unwilling now to participate in public discourse of any kind relating to Israel and Gaza, and that has implications not just for the non-citizens who are silenced, but for the citizens who don't hear their views. And the First Amendment has been understood for a long time, for more than 50 years, to protect not just the right to speak, but the right to hear as well. So we should see, I think that means that we should see these arrests not just as an infringement of the non-citizens' rights, but as an infringement of the citizens' rights as well, because it's an infringement on our right to hear speech that we have a right to hear.
Let me ask you finally, there was a woman who testified in the trial. She had been a professor in Iraq, and she gave very powerful testimony and said, this reminds me of the days of Saddam Hussein, where professors and academics were worried on finding themselves on the wrong side of the government. It could be a deadly moment. And she sort of feels like we're reaching something like that, where the consequences of being on the wrong side of the government are very serious. Has it come to that, where those in this profession are now being driven by political considerations as opposed to empiricism and to inquiry of the kind of debates that we've been proud of American universities of generating?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that testimony was extremely powerful, and especially so, there were three non-citizen professors who testified in the case, and you have to just think about how courageous you need to be as a non-citizen in this country right now to come forward in a suit against the government and say and assert your right to participate in pro-Palestinian protests, at a moment when the government has already made clear that is very willing to arrest and imprison and deport people who participate in that kind of protest. But these three non-citizen professors came forward anyway and testified in this case, and it's really worth looking at their testimony. I mean, it was just so powerful in not just in the description of the chill that they say exists on campuses across the country, but also in the parallels they drew between Iraq or in other cases Germany 75 years ago. They really do see the United States going down a terrible road, and some of them have seen their own countries go down roads like this before, and don't want to see that happen here.
Well, fascinating and important. Thank you so much, Jamil Jaffer, Executive Director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? Not that long ago, if someone asked, should I steer clear of America if I've been critical of the U.S. government, they'd be laughed out of the room. Folks would tell them, this is America. Say whatever you want. Well, guess what? Times have really changed, big time. For a country that always lectured other countries about thinking beyond their boxes and looking for better paths for mankind, it's a big deal to lose the safety of a free, open, and honest intellectual thought and debate. Careers can be ended now, and folks are being rounded up for detention or deportation for expressing outrage about the killing and starvation of innocent people in Gaza today. And that's exactly what the suppression of speech looks like. America's constitutional rights are really wobbly right now, and the question of whether speech remains protected or weaponized is literally up for grabs. And that's the bottom line.